All right. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight as we continue our discussion about heading back to school during the culture wars. We know that schools have unfortunately become a battleground for these culture wars and that our kids are being affected. I'm Carrie McMillan. I'm a counselor and I worked as a public school counselor in the Rochester area for several years. I experienced a lot of these issues firsthand. And this is my colleague, Bridget Heap, who is a wonderful homeschooling mom of two and co-author of The Sexual Holocaust, A Global Crisis. We are both research associates with Feed My Sheep Foundation, a nonprofit organization focused on promoting a biblical worldview. This is the second half of this webinar series, so if you weren't able to join us live last week for part one, we do encourage you to check out the recording, which is on our website. So you can find the recording by going to fmsfound.org, where you are now if you're joining us live, then click on webinars and go to past webinars in the drop-down menu. We've also put together a resource guide for you with some keynotes from this webinar series and additional resources and links. So this is located just below the video feed on the live webinars page. So now that we are presenting live, you may need to go back to that main live webinars page when the webinar ends to download this. As I mentioned, we are presenting live, so we will have an opportunity for you to ask questions. At any point throughout the presentation, you can text questions to us using the phone number on the screen. We will be taking time at the end of the presentation to go through and answer questions with our guest speaker.
Okay, so last week we talked about how schools are a breeding ground of activism and woke indoctrination. We also talked about how schools are now being used as a mechanism to reduce parental rights, and government-funded schools are replacing parental authority for teaching values. So though there are three main concerning cultural ideologies being promoted through schools right now, we only had time last time to discuss the normalization of gender confusion and the sexualization of children. So last week, we first looked at the concepts of truth and love and how activists are teaching our children new definitions of words and concepts which make their ideologies appear true and loving. Then we looked specifically at why the current gender ideology, which is being taught in schools, is not true and why it's not loving. Finally, we did the same thing for the current ideology of sexuality, showing that this underlying perspective, again, is not true, nor is it loving. Now, we hope that last week's webinar helped to give you an overview on two of the major current cultural wars raging right now. And so that brings us to our agenda tonight. So tonight will be a discussion on the practical ways to prepare your children for this coming school year.
And that's right. We have the pleasure of introducing you all to Dr. Erin Brewer. Erin is co-founder of Advocates Protecting Children, which is an incredible resource that's been very helpful for me. For anyone looking for more information on the transgender issue, I really recommend the Advocates Protecting Children group. She is also author of several books, including her newest, Parenting in a Transgender World, which she'll be presenting about tonight. So after Erin shares her presentation with us all, Bridget and I will be jumping back on and taking a few minutes to share with you specific action items that you can consider taking as it relates to kids heading back to school. Then to wrap up, we will have a time for a Q&A, so certainly text any questions to the text line on your screen. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Erin Brewer.
Thank you so much for having me tonight, and I am just honored to be able to share this information. I hope it's valuable for people. I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation. And as you mentioned, my presentation is called Parenting in a Transgender World, and I'm just going to briefly go over some of the information that you covered last week about how deeply entrenched this ideology is in our schools and in our culture, because I think people just really don't understand. This is the genderbread person, and this is introduced into schools as early as kindergarten. Children are taught that they are that they can be male or female or neither or both. This is an incredibly confusing concept for children. The Human Rights Campaign has actively infiltrated our schools. They are providing lesson plans, book lists, and resources for teachers, and specifically supporting the concept of transgender non-binary students. In addition, we have, this is from the Center for Disease Control, believe it or not, in conjunction with Chicago Public Schools. And this is telling staff not to disclose a student's transgender or gender nonconforming status to parents or guardians. So this is very disturbing. This could be happening to your child and you wouldn't even know it because teachers are actively hiding children's gender identity issues from their parents. And it's in our culture. This is a screenshot from a Blue's Clues video. And if you look down in the corner, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but there's a little beaver here who has scars from having a double mastectomy. This is part of what happens with the transgender ideology as girls are having their breasts removed, as we have documentation of that happening as young as 12 years old. And we have it, on our TVs almost every night. There's a story about transgender ideology. Here we have a man who is competing against women, who is walking around locker rooms, and he's a fully intact male. And it's very disturbing to the women who have to share that locker room with him, not to mention taking opportunities away from the women that he competed against. So I want to briefly go over the indoctrination process that transgender activists use, just so you have an idea of what they're doing with their children. So they have a recruitment method. First, they target vulnerable children. They actively go after kids who are maybe not fitting in, who maybe are on autism spectrum, who maybe are suffering from PTSD or trauma, or depression or anxiety. Those are the kids that they actively target. And then they do something called love bombing, which is when they just shower that child with love, tell them that they are the most amazing person in the world and that everybody should love them. These are kids who probably haven't gotten a lot of affirmation and affection and attention during their lives. And so this is incredibly welcome to them. Suddenly they're fitting in, suddenly they have friends and what feels like a family at school. And then they encourage that child to isolate from anybody who doesn't accept the transgender ideology. They tell the child things like, if your parents are not accepting of your identity, I'm your mom now. They're actively taking over the role of parent. This is a transgender influencer. And as you can see, he says, it's time to go on the offensive. I won't rest until every American child has been transed. They're actively trying to recruit your children to this ideology. Another thing that they're advocating is that all children should be put on puberty blockers. So to wait until they have determined what sex or whether or not they even want to be male or female. And for those of you who aren't familiar with puberty blockers, they induce retardation. They're basically retarding the growth and development of otherwise healthy children. And the activists are suggesting that all children should go on these so that they're given time to decide what gender they want to be. And then they have a conversion process where they actively try and get these children to adopt a transgender identity. And that involves manipulating the memory. They will tell kids that they were always trans, that they just repressed their trans identity because their parents weren't loving or accepting. They really manipulate the identity. They try and encourage the child to kill who they are and become somebody else, basically to dissociate from who they are. They manipulate reality. They say that men can be women and women can be men and that somebody can be neither or both, and that it's all based on their feelings. And often these are very regressive stereotypes of what it means to be male or female. They manipulate their thoughts. They do a lot of thought-stopping techniques. So if children start to ask questions, they're told they're bigots or they're told that that's a hateful question. And so they're not allowed to pursue any questions that they have. And then they do othering, which is something that totalitarian regimes do. They suggest that anybody who doesn't adhere to this ideology is a hateful bigot. And oftentimes they suggest that these are people who aren't fully human and maybe don't even deserve to live because of they're not ascribing to this ideology. So it's a very dangerous ideology. And they also use a lot of coercion. They encourage kids to run away from home if their parents don't accept them. We currently have legislation in California that has been proposed to make that a sanctuary state where children can go to get treatments if their state doesn't allow it or if their parents aren't allowing it. And again, it's all part of trying to get kids to buy into this ideology and fracture families so that they can basically undermine our values. This is one of the most common things they say. They tell parents and teachers and professionals that if a child tells you that they're transgender, you can either accept the child as transgender or have a dead child, that those are your only two options. And that's just not true. It's factually incorrect. And it's also incredibly manipulative. This is emotional blackmail, and we shouldn't be standing for it. And this is what happens when children are trans. If you're not familiar with these images, the first image is of a girl who's had her breasts cut off. And as you can see, they're increasingly cutting off breasts and nipple as well, leaving these kids completely flat-chested. The middle picture is of an arm where the flesh has been removed in order to create a fake penis. And the bottom picture is where the flesh of one leg has been used to put over the scar on the arm. And then the skin from the other leg has been used to put over that wound. I mean, it's just incredibly dangerous. People die from these operations. They are not in any way safe. And not only that, but they're not effective in helping children who are struggling with gender identity issues to resolve their difficult feelings. So you need to know how to protect your family from this. And this is a very powerful ideology. So it's really important to kind of arm yourself against what's happening. First of all, I like to suggest doing something called reality grounding, and do this with little kids. Do this as soon as your kids are, old enough to even understand what a picture is. Show them pictures when they're still infants on your lap. Show them how they're part of your family. Show the progression of their development as part of your family. Put pictures up in rooms so that when kids come home from school, they see pictures of themselves with their family. That will help to undermine the reality manipulation that transgender activists do. Oftentimes, they'll tell kids that they were unhappy as children, or that they were always transgender, they just didn't know it. And if the kids have pictures that they can look at and that they've looked at their whole life, it sort of helps them with the grounding in what really is true. The other thing is reminiscing. Spend time talking to your kids about things that you did when they were little, about the good times and maybe the bad times and the family times, so that they have a really strong connection with the past and that they know what their history is, because it's harder to change somebody's memories if they have good, solid memories of the past that are firmly implanted in there. And also build relationships with the children and within the family so that that child really feels like they're part of the family. One of the reasons that these kids are able to be indoctrinated is they don't have a really firm sense of feeling part of a family. And if they feel like they're really part of a family, if those connections are strong, they're less likely to be vulnerable. And the other thing that I suggest is something called snowballing memories. One of the ways that transgender activists are effective is by manipulating a child's memories of the past. And if you layer those memories like a snowball, you start with one memory and then you add another memory over it and another memory over it, it's harder for people to break those memories apart and insert false memories. And so you can think of this as maybe, when you went to a park when the child was a toddler, and talk about that. And then maybe go to the park again when the child has a birthday. And you can talk about how you went to the park when they were a toddler. And, oh, we went again when you had the birthday. And then, oh, remember when we went there and you played with so-and-so. And just keep building those memories so the child has a really firm sense of what really happened in their childhood. Because it is possible to implant false memories. And the trans activists are really good at it because they're basically indoctrinating your child into a cult. The next is to form a really firm family identity. You want your child to feel really like your family is something bigger than just themselves. So make sure you have traditions that they can look forward to. If you currently don't have any, you can develop some traditions. Something as simple as, maybe every March 1st, you go get ice cream. And that's the day that you go get ice cream. And that's part of your family tradition. Or every Christmas, you have gingerbread and hot cocoa. And that's part of your tradition. Make sure that you develop a family holiday. So this is a holiday that is just your family's special time together, whether it's the 4th of July when you do something really special as a family, or you have a random date and you declare that to be your family's holiday and think of something really special to do. Have family journals and maybe even a blog. Kids are very into technology these days, and you can create a family blog and have some kind of ritual about contributing entries into that family journal or blog so that it feels like the child's involved with that. Think of family greetings that you can do. So, when your child comes in from school, have some kind of very specific family greeting that you do. Maybe a high five or a fist bump or, a hug or something that you always say and the child says back to you. So the child has a very strong sense of being welcome home when they come home from school. And have daily rituals. This can be something as simple as, sitting down for breakfast and then maybe doing something before going to school, or, sitting down with your child and reading a book every night before bed, or having, bath time, brush teeth, bedtime, things that are predictable so that the child really feels grounded within that family. The family is the most protective unit. And if you, one of the ways that transgender activists insinuate themselves into your child's life is to say, your family doesn't love you and we do. If your child knows beyond a shadow of a doubt that they are loved and that they are part of your family, they're going to be less vulnerable. The other thing that the transgender activists do is something called values clarification. This is a term that's actually used in comprehensive sexuality education. They do this as part of the school curriculum. They try and break down your child's values. So what you need to do is prepare them for this. And if they know ahead of time that their values are going to be challenged, they're going to be prepared for this. And I have parents ask me all the time, should I just ignore what's happening and hope that it doesn't impact my child, or should I talk to them about it? And I really encourage you to talk to your child about what's happening, because if you don't get there first, the transgender activists will. So in order to prepare your child for these challenges to their values, introduce these values very early. And I mean, when they're toddlers, when they're really early, start talking about these values with them. When you're watching a TV show or when you're reading a book, use it as an opportunity to enforce your family values. And some values that I suggest that are protective against the transgender ideology are that all people are born either male or female, that males are boys and men, and that females are girls and women. And this seems really obvious to most people, but in school, they're going to hear something different. And so they need to have heard this from you, from them, from as early on as they can remember. You want to encourage them to believe that people are male and female based on biology and not on feelings. And I find this so ironic that oftentimes Christian conservatives are sort of attacked for not believing in science. And yet in this case, we are saying biology is important. You need to, ground yourself in biology. And their entire ideology is based on feelings. And so if you can show your child, the beauty of the difference between males and females, and, if your family believes in God, how God created males and females to complement each other, that's going to be protective. Also encourage them to understand that appearance does not change if someone is male or female. Oftentimes children, they have very magical thinking. And sometimes they believe that if a boy puts on a dress, he actually becomes a girl. And so when you're doing make-believe play, you can use this as an opportunity to talk to children about the permanence of biological sex, that no matter how somebody dresses up, they are still the sex that they are born, that they cannot change that. And you need to let them know not everybody knows this, because a lot of kids are going to think this is pretty obvious, and they're not going to realize that they're going to go to school and they're going to run into people who do not believe this. Or if you're homeschooling, they might run into it in an extracurricular activity that you have planned, or they might see it on TV or on the computer. This ideology has become so entrenched in our culture, it's really hard to avoid it. Let them know that some people are going to try and mislead them. I think this is important for all kids to know, but especially related to this ideology. And let them know if anybody encourages them to hide their feelings from their parents, that they need to tell you immediately. This is predatory behavior and we should not accept it. And unfortunately, we have teachers who will say things in school like, what we're going to talk about now is just between us in the class and it's private and we don't want you to share it with your parents. That should be a red flag to your child to go right home and tell you what happened. And so instill within your children this idea that it's really important for them to come to you if somebody tries to encourage them to hide something. The next thing you want to do is focus on skill building. We talked about grounding within the family. We also need to instill personal grounding skills. If you Google grounding skills, you will find a whole bunch of different resources that you can use. But basically, there are lots of different grounding techniques that draw upon the senses. And what grounding techniques do is if a child's experiencing anxiety or stress or anger or frustration, if they can draw upon these skills, it helps to kind of pull them back into themselves and their body. And one of the ways that the transgender ideology works is to tell kids that they are separate from their body. So you really want to work with your child to understand that their body is who they are, that they're all one, they're not separate. And so if you can do things like knead bread with your kids and let them feel that bread and talk about how, they're kneading their bread with their hands and their hands are part of them. Play out in the dirt, do some gardening. When you smell different smells, talk about how that's all part of your body that allows you to, enjoy the smell of cinnamon or vanilla. When you listen to music, talk about how that's part of your brain and part of who you are is enjoying music, and how people who are deaf can actually feel music with their bodies because we're not separate from our bodies. We're all one person. The other thing that you want to instill is positive self-talk. One of the ways that transgender activists insinuate themselves into your child's mind is by giving them negative messages that, who they are isn't okay, that there's something wrong with them, that they need to change who they are in order to become an authentic person. And one of the things you can do is if your child's having a difficult time, ask them to articulate what it is that they're thinking and feeling so that you can hear the kinds of messages that they're giving themselves and try to reframe those messages. So if your kid comes home from school and says, I'm so stupid, I failed a test, instead of, challenge your child and say, well, I don't think you're stupid. Did you study for that test? Maybe you need to tell yourself that you can be successful if you work hard and study instead of that you're stupid, and try to instill those more positive messages. The next thing I encourage is critical thinking skills. That this ideology is all based on, I call it kind of mumbo jumbo. I mean, it's just nonsense. There is no internal coherency to it. And so if your kids are good critical thinkers, they're going to see right through this ideology. They're going to say, you know what? A man doesn't become a woman simply because he says he's a woman. That makes no sense. And those are really important skills. So discuss misrepresentations in the media. If you're watching the news together, or if you're looking through a magazine and there's something related to this transgender ideology, talk to your child about it and point out to them, like, look how misleading this particular story is about legislation that's stopping boys from competing against girls. Here it's saying that they're not going to allow these kids to compete in sports, when in fact, what they're actually saying is that we don't want boys competing against girls. Or look at the story. It says people are trying to prevent transgender children from using the bathroom. Do you think that's true? Do you think they're really trying to prevent children from using the bathroom? Or are they just trying to say that boys should use the boys' bathrooms and girls should use the girls' bathrooms? So really broach these topics with your kids. Also help them to understand methodological flaws in research. And this might sound heavy. I know a lot of people might be like, well, I don't even know about methodological flaws in research, but you can Google methodological flaws in research and you can get up to speed pretty quickly on some of the most common ways in which research is done in a way that isn't scientifically sound. And if your kids are able to see through the research that's being used to support the transgender ideology, then they're going to be less vulnerable to it. And the research that's used to support the transgender ideology is incredibly flawed. And I go through in my book and talk about a lot of those flaws. But if you Google methodological flaws, you'll find them that way as well. I also encourage you to talk about logical fallacies. One of the things that we talked about on an earlier slide is that the transgender activists will say, you can either accept your child as transgender or they're going to be dead by suicide. And that's a false dichotomy. A false dichotomy is when you say, you have this choice or this choice, when in fact you have a whole range of choices in between there. And that's one of the things that the transgender activists do all the time is they present these false dichotomies and a whole lot of other logical fallacies. And if your child understands those and is able to see through them, then they're going to not only be able to push back against the gender ideology, but they're also going to be able to help their friends to see how flawed the transgender ideology is. Another important thing is called locus of control. And for those who don't know this term, the idea is that some people believe that they have no power over their lives, that things just sort of happen to them. They're sort of like a pinball in a pinball machine, sort of being batted around by life, and that they have no control. And that's called an external locus of control. It's very disempowering. And that's the kind of locus of control that transgender activism pushes. This idea that if somebody misgenders a person or calls them by the wrong pronoun, that it's actual violence and that person might commit suicide because of it. That is very much an external locus of control, that you are impacted to the point of potentially being suicidal by something somebody else says. That's very disempowering. Whereas an internal locus of control is the idea that the choices that you make, that you have control over your emotions, that what you do matters, that you can change your circumstances. Those are all very empowering, that your choices matter and that you can overcome challenges, that you can have very difficult feelings and survive them and thrive. And not only that, but that all children struggle with the same issues. And if children feel like they have control over their lives, that they have some degree of impact, that they can change their situation based on their behavior or their feelings, that's going to have a huge impact. And a lot of kids are taught that their feelings are their feelings and there's nothing that they can do about them. When in fact, we know that there's a lot that you can do about negative feelings. One of the primary therapeutic techniques that's used to help people change their feelings is called cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea is that you tell yourself a different story. So if you're having a bad feeling about yourself, say somebody said something hurtful to you, you can either say, oh my gosh, that person's right. I am, ugly or stupid or lazy or whatever it was that they said. Or you can change the story that you're telling yourself and you can say, you know what? That person said something really hurtful and I didn't like it, but it's not true. Or maybe that person pointed something out about me that I don't like, and I'm going to work to change it. So there are all different ways that you can empower a child to have that internal locus of control that will make them so much less vulnerable to being recruited into transgender activism. And finally, boundaries are really important. A lot of parents these days believe that it's their job to be their child's friend, and they want their child to be happy. And this is ultimately what's undoing our families. Children really need parents to set boundaries. That's our job as a parent. And we need to have boundaries around phones. Children should never be taking phones to their bedroom at night. We need to have boundaries around computers. Computers should be used in a common space where parents can see them, and you should have parental control on them. And social media, really children younger than about 16 probably shouldn't be on social media at all. Older children need to be, they need to be watched. They need to have some boundaries. And you as parents need to have access to their accounts. And again, a lot of parents say, oh my gosh, I don't want to do that. My child wouldn't like it. Well, that's okay. It's okay for us to do things that children don't like. That's our job as parents. In the same way that we wouldn't let our child run across the street in front of a car because it could hurt them. We need to have these kind of boundaries in our home because transgender activism is coming right in our home through phones and computers and social media. And if you don't put those boundaries up, your child can get indoctrinated. And the last thing is, which is a little bit difficult, but I call it housekeeping. And this is to address any struggles that you're having within the house. If your child has had some trauma, try to address that with a pastor or a loving adult, somebody that you trust. If your child has had some issues and needs to go to therapy, make sure that you find a therapist that doesn't buy into this ideology. Really screen them carefully, because most therapists at this point will encourage a child to accept a transgender identity and tell that child that their parents are hateful if they don't accept them as transgender. So if there is, depression or anger or addiction within the home, either within the parents or within the children, make sure you sort that out, because kids need to have a solid home. It's easy to sort of pretend like those problems don't exist. We all struggle with difficulties in our families, and it's just important to do everything we can to address those. And the other thing is marital strife. This ideology will do everything they can to break you apart as a family. And if you and your spouse are tight and together and on the same page with this, it's going to be much harder for the activists to break apart you and your family. I also encourage you to fight back. We're at a point where this ideology is so dangerous that we can't just protect our children. We need to do everything we can to push back on it so that it doesn't just, so we aren't just protecting our own family, but we're protecting all children, because this is so damaging. So what can you do? There's a lot you can do. A lot of people feel like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming. But there are lots of very simple things you can do. I always say, if you have 5 minutes a week, you can make a difference. And one of them is to make submissions. So anytime there's a policy, whether it's at your local school, school board, state level, or federal level, anytime there's legislative efforts or policy initiatives relating to transgender ideology, make a submission. Tell them why you don't support this ideology. Consider sending a letter to the editor about why it is that you don't support having men competing against women, or why you think that boys shouldn't be allowed in girls' locker rooms, or why you think it's damaging to induce retardation among children with puberty blockers, or to cut off healthy children's breasts. Try to pay attention to action alerts. I know that Advocates Protecting Children has action alerts that we send out periodically. A lot of other organizations do as well. So if you're aware of those, then when there's an action, you can make a difference. Have conversations with faith leaders. A lot of the faith leaders are overwhelmed right now. They're not sure what to do, and they're hoping it will just go away. And so they're not being proactive. And if you have conversations with them and say, you need to address this and make sure this doesn't come into our church and infiltrate our youth groups, that's going to be really powerful. Contact companies. We recently had an issue with State Farm Insurance where they were giving a grant to a transgender organization that puts books in schools. And people were up in arms and were actively calling State Farm and saying, I'm going to cancel my policy if you continue with this program. And within a day, State Farm pulled back and said, we are no longer going to participate in supporting this transgender organization. One store, Target, is one that actively allows men to go in women's bathrooms and women to go in men's bathrooms. Let Target know you won't shop there because you don't feel safe. Starbucks is another one. Tell them you will not give them your business until they change their policies. Consider letter writing campaigns to policymakers. Get a bunch of people together and send out letters all at once. That can be really powerful, especially handwritten letters, because policymakers often don't get those anymore. Another thing is to make up flyers and put them in pockets at say, maybe Target. Go in and go into the clothing section and stick a flyer in the pocket of the clothes that they're selling, or put a flyer in grocery carts at your local grocery store. Consider organizing a protest at gender clinics or Planned Parenthood or at children's hospitals. You don't need to have a lot of people, but if you get maybe 10 to 20 people to do a small protest in front of one of these places that is actively providing these incredibly dangerous interventions to children, there's a possibility that you'll get news coverage, and that helps to spread the message. But also the people within those clinics know somebody's watching, and that's powerful too. Consider going to school board meetings and speak your mind. This is one of the reasons that this has gone as far as it is that nobody stood up and said, this is not okay. And consider joining a pro-trans group and recording the meetings so that you have documentation of what's going on. This is my book. It's called Parenting in a Transgender World. It has a lot more in-depth ideas about what I've talked about. And I also encourage you to go to transgenderissues.org, which has a whole bunch of really good videos about different aspects of transgender ideology if you need to get up to speed. Advocates Protecting Children also has a number of different books that I'd encourage you to explore if you want more information. And finally, I just wanted to let you know why I'm so passionate about this. And it's because I was a trans-identified child when I was little. And thankfully, my teachers did not affirm me. Thankfully, I lived at a time where they referred me to the school psychologist for help. And I know that if I had had the option when I was a child, I would have medically transitioned in an instant. And I'm so thankful I did not have that option. And I feel like it's my duty, it's my responsibility. I feel really called to do everything I can to help to prevent kids from getting these incredibly damaging interventions and to push back against this ideology that would have told me that I was actually a boy stuck in a girl's body. And the best thing I could do is to kill myself as a girl and become Timothy, the boy that I wanted to be. And that's, it's just an incredibly damaging ideology. So I want to thank you. I want to thank Feed My Sheep so much for doing all this important work on this issue.
Thank you so much, Erin. So we're just going to switch over here to our slides. So just give us 1 second. All right, and that was very powerful. We do appreciate too your vulnerability, Erin, and sharing your story with us and all of the countless hours of research that you've done to put together your resources. And I certainly have loved following along with the information that you put out because it's just helpful for the different organizations that we participate in to use. You have images to put on social media. You've just got so much. So thank you for the work that you are doing as well. So as we do transition into this last portion of tonight's webinar, we want to be clear that everything that Erin just spoke about are exactly what we are asking parents to do. And it is a strategy to prepare your children to face these ideologies in school. And so talking to your children, really building that family unit, laying a foundation of truth, we need those things and our children need those things. So now we're going to talk about some more specific action items for the schools. And so we just wanted to expand on that a little bit. And so Bridget's going to start us off.
Okay, so the first action item that we recommend is for parents to do their homework and to learn about the different types of schooling available to them and their children. So some examples may include public schools, charter schools, private schools, micro schools, and homeschooling. Since parents are responsible for their children's education, parents should have the freedom to choose what style of education best fits their family structure and values. So if you are considering a private or charter school, you will still need to do your research to know if the school shares your values. Now, I personally have chosen to homeschool, so if you have any questions about that, I would be happy to talk to you about that. And we just recommend that you get to know your options. So take a look at what is available in your area.
So the Family Policy Alliance and Focus on the Family, they put together a Back to School for Parents guide, which I found to be a really excellent summary of the issues that we've addressed thus far in this webinar series. And the link for the free guide is listed on our webinar's parent resource guide for you. So throughout this guide, they remind parents about their child's rights and their freedom of religion in school. And I think it's important that we spend some time encouraging the children in our lives as they head back to school with understanding their rights in an age-appropriate and relevant way. So first of all, we want to say that the state cannot force students to act in a manner that violates their religious beliefs. So if your child objects to classroom content because of their personal religious beliefs, help them to submit a letter to the school in writing with their objections. Your child also has the right to express their beliefs at school and specifically in the classroom as well. So as long as they're not doing it in a disruptive or inappropriate way, your child can't be censored or disciplined for expressing their beliefs because we have a First Amendment right to free speech. The right to free speech also includes the right not to speak or to be silent. So your child can't be forced to say things that go against their faith or conscience. They cannot be forced to promote certain ideologies or use transgender pronouns verbally or in written form. Your child also has a right to bodily privacy. So this means that if the school district or state requires co-ed bathrooms due to their transgender laws, and we have mostly New York viewers, and certainly this is the case in New York, your schools do have co-ed bathrooms. Even if they are still men and women's, anybody can go into either bathroom depending on how they feel. And so have your child decide to access the single stall restroom. So the school has to provide an alternative to your child or a changing facility for gym or for their sports. They have to have private facilities for your child. And finally, your child has the right to attend school without a hostile environment. So certainly if they're being harassed for their beliefs, please document any harassment or bullying and immediately report it to your school administration. And if it's not being handled properly, you might even file complaints with the state or federal departments of education. So I also want to encourage you to check out your mental health support. And so I wanted to just share a short little personal story here. When I worked in the public school, I was so happy when we partnered with a local organization because one of their counselors was able to meet with students right in our school building. And it removed a lot of barriers that many families were having for accessing much needed mental health support that we could not address in school, real serious mental illness. And their parents might not have had transportation, or they couldn't take time off of work, or didn't understand the seriousness of the issue and, weren't accessing help. So I was real excited about this partnership, and I sent a lot of students over to this counselor. But now I'm realizing how much that it actually lessened the parental involvement in that process. And not only that, but this counselor, I later learned, is an actual activist for these ideologies, and in her own school district is promoting these ideologies and starting elementary clubs. And I participated in that. And so I was not aware. And I just encourage you, if your child needs mental health support, as Erin Brewer mentioned, like, we need to be screening this. We need to be talking to the mental health counselors. We need to be talking to them about their positions on these things. And I do just recommend doing that research ahead of time and being involved in every aspect of your child's life, including their mental health support. So questions to ask might include, are you going to immediately affirm my child if they express a gender identity different from their biological sex? And so there are other options for your children. As Erin mentioned, you can talk to a pastor or someone else in your life that you trust. But there's also biblical counselors that don't ascribe to the affirmative model, the flawed affirmative model that most mental health counselors, unfortunately, are ascribing to. In many states, including in New York right now, you can opt your child out of harmful instruction like comprehensive sex education that is going to include, as we mentioned last time, a lot of the gender ideology, but also a lot of sexualizing and very concerning education. And so we have resources for you in the resource guide about this. First, we have a link to the website stopcsc.org, which is full of resources for you on this topic, including example opt-out forms that you can use, one from the Liberty Council that is really excellent. And we've also included an opt-out letter directly in the resource guide for you that you can use. And this doesn't just opt out of sex ed, but is also asking your school to opt your child out of any harmful instruction about gender, any surveys that contain harmful questions, any instruction that's connected to harmful standards like the National Sex Ed Standards, or instruction from guest speakers from organizations like Planned Parenthood. And this has been reviewed by attorneys through multiple organizations, has not yet been tested in court, but it is a thorough form that will initiate a great opportunity to share your perspective with the school regarding your child's education and to make just a strong effort at the beginning of the school year to protect your kid while they're going to school.
Okay, so another step that we recommend is to get to know your child's teachers. So the goal is to build a positive relationship with them as the year starts and to learn their perspective so that you can both work together and communicate well for the benefit of your child. And so one of the things that we have here are just some questions that you may want to ask the teachers when you schedule a meeting with them. So the first question is, what are their personal views on these issues? How do they handle these topics in class? Will they have, a special lesson to celebrate the awareness days? Will you notify me if my child expresses a gender identity that's different from his or her biological sex? You can also ask the teacher what books are available to the students in their classroom. And then you can also ask what curriculums the teachers are using.
And I just wanted to mention a quick story here. Bridget and I were just talking about how when I was at the school, I had a parent who I so respect now, especially knowing what I know, that had sent in an opt-out letter. And this is when I was at the elementary level, and opted the child out from meeting with me as the counselor. And I was like, what? And then also I had initiated some social emotional learning in the classroom to help kids learn how to breathe and get along better. And though the lessons I selected were appropriate and I thought they were great, and as a Christian, I was like, what does this guy think I'm going to teach? But I reached out to the parent and we talked about the lessons and we talked about my interactions with the student. We formed a positive relationship and it worked out great. And the student was able to participate because the lessons that I had chosen, I shared with that parent. But, I pushed that. I would have, of course, rathered it be on the other end. And I think most teachers would have too, rather than just initially sending that letter in, reach out to that person and talk to them about it and form that relationship, because the more positive that it is, the more you're going to find out and the more information you're going to be able to gather through just a friendly relationship. So we do encourage you to start the relationship in a kind way and then, of course, be direct and set healthy boundaries for your child.
Yeah, absolutely. So just like you can request a meeting with the teacher, you can request a meeting with the librarian, and you can ask about the content of the books in the library and if there are any policies that make sure that children are not accessing inappropriate content and so forth. So things like that. Now, to help you with this, we've actually included 2 resources for you on our parent resource guide. So the first is Go Full Let, where you can search your child's library. Now, you can also take a look at ratedbooks.org, and this has a list of books that have been rated to help you get an idea of the content of certain books that your children may be reading or may have access to in the libraries. So we recommend also that if you are concerned about the books that your children can access at their school library, that you actually meet with the school librarian and request that you, as the parent, have to approve the books that your child is checking out of the library. So that is an option that you may want to consider. Now, parents have been mostly kept out of schools the past couple of years because of COVID. So hopefully that is lessening, and we're hoping that parents can actually be more involved in their child's school and their education. Now, at some schools, you can volunteer in the school library, and if you choose to do so, that could also help you to get to know some of the books that are available in the libraries and some of the policies and how they handle things. But there also may be a variety of other ways that you can volunteer in your district. So, we recommend that you ask how you can get involved. And remember, the more that you're present in the school, the more that you will have a pulse on what's actually going on and can address it with your own children.
So meeting with all levels of your administration can be helpful at different points in addressing these issues. So it's best to meet with your building level principals for any building level issues. So for example, the principal is the one who will be familiar with the clubs that are available for your child to join and if they need permission from you to join them or not. They'll also know about what special trans days are going to be celebrated or what volunteer opportunities there may be for you or what guest speakers are coming in. This will also be who you're going to want to submit your opt-out forms to at first. And again, you can send it to other people in the district as well, like the school counselor or social work office. And this is going to be your first line to address any specific issues that arise as well. They may know about curriculum, and they may also more likely direct you to a director of curriculum or a superintendent of curriculum. We do recommend that you formally request to review the curriculum at your school. And if you're having trouble with this, there are some resources available for you that even help you walk through the formal requests using the Freedom of Information Act. Now, the superintendent is the right person to speak with about any district level concerns that you have. So district level policies that are in place regarding sports teams or the bathrooms. They may also be able to help you with issues that are still existing after you've spoken with your principal. And then the Board of Education. So the principal reports to the superintendent, who reports to the Board of Education. And the Board of Ed meetings are going to be the best place to speak about these issues to gain some public awareness. So this is where the community has an opportunity to participate and make their voice known as taxpayers in the district. You do not have to be a parent in that district. You can just be a taxpayer and show up and speak because you are participating in that district. Especially when a district is considering new policies. This is a great opportunity for you to have your voice be heard on those policies. The board also approves curriculum to use. So this is a great group to share your concerns with about what curriculum your child is exposed to, or even to offer suggestions of better curriculum options.
Okay, so we know that all of this is very difficult, and there is no need to fight this battle alone. So we recommend that you find out what groups are in your local area. So for example, many counties have a Moms for Liberty group. Canandaigua recently started a Help Not Harm group focused on fighting the gender indoctrination in their district. We've also presented to a Cattaraugus County group that is actively involved in going to the school board meetings together. And then we also recently presented to a group of parents in Pittsford who are trying to stand up against the harmful instruction in their school district. And, you know, I've talked to a mom who also said that Livonia has a parents Facebook page, which is a place where they can share information with one another, and they can, you know, join each other when they go to the school board meetings together as well. So if your district has a group, we highly recommend that you please join. There is power in numbers. But if your district does not yet have a group, I can guarantee you that you are not the only parent who wants one. And so please consider starting a group, even if it is just starting with one other parent or grandparent.
So in summary, there is a lot that can be done. And there is even more that we haven't even gotten into tonight. And I know Erin mentioned a lot, and we just focused in on just the school stuff. So this is probably overwhelming, but know that these are not all action items that apply necessarily to your specific situation. So for example, I'm not yet a parent. And so I started by speaking to my district superintendent and Board of Education. I provided them with resources and information that would equip them to hopefully know both sides of this issue. And they were very receptive to that. And we have a continuing conversation. So everyone can help in some way. And like Erin mentioned, even just 5 minutes a week, you can make a difference in this issue. So your situation and giftings will determine what you feel like are the best next steps for you. And we just encourage you to determine to take a next step that will help protect kids in your area or in your family. Okay, so now we're going to open it up for questions. So we're going to check out our texting line. So feel free to send questions there if you haven't already. The phone number is 833-942-6158. And hopefully you can see that if you are watching live. It should be on your screen as well. 942-6158. And it looks like we have some coming in. Okay, Erin. So someone said, thank you for this wonderful information. Erin, what helped you from realizing that you were not a boy or should not try to be a boy?
That's a really good question. First of all, I want to give some background. Most children who develop gender issues when I was younger, it was the result of something pretty powerful in their lives. In my case, it was a sexual assault that happened. And so adopting a transgender identity was my way of saying, I'm not going to let that happen ever again. I'm going to be a boy. And so really, I got some great help from incredibly loving and kind teachers and from therapists who helped me to understand that the sexual assault wasn't my fault and that becoming a boy wasn't the solution. And so getting some good coping skills to replace that misbelief that I had that I wasn't safe being a girl. These days, a lot of kids are adopting a transgender identity because they're being actively recruited. So it's very different than my situation. But kids who have had sexual assault or other trauma are especially vulnerable to being recruited. So they're ones that you really have to keep an eye on. If you have a child who has had some kind of a significant trauma, I would highly encourage you to homeschool if at all possible, because they need that extra support. And they're so much more likely to be a target if they go into the public schools.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah, we do appreciate your vulnerability. I've heard you speak to, you've posted on some of your groups, your testimonies for legislation when they're proposing new legislation and you go in and speak, and you have a very powerful testimony that I think has made a real huge difference in a lot of states. So thank you for being willing to share such dark places of your history, you know?
Yeah, it's hard to talk about, but I'm not the only one. There are increasingly people are coming out with very similar stories to mine. And I'm so thankful that people are willing to speak out, because it's so important that we protect kids from this ideology. And I think the only way we're going to do it is if we hold the medical practitioners accountable. And we need to do that with legislative efforts.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So is there a teacher version of the Back to School for Parents guide? There is. So there is a Navigating the Transgender Landscape, I believe is the title of it. And we did include that on the resource guide that you can download just below the live webinar that you're watching now. So that's a wonderful resource. That's one of the ones that I shared with my superintendent. If I had had that when I was a school counselor, I think I would have handled things a lot differently. I just felt so alone and questioning what was going on. And I felt like I had to go along with certain things just because everyone else was, and that was what was expected. And that was just the new way of the world. And if I was going to be in the world, that was what I had to do, but you don't. So if you are a teacher watching this, or any administrator or school staff, you do not have to go along with it. And there are other teachers fighting this and winning. There are also some discouraging stories, but we can learn from both. And hopefully that resource guide will be helpful for you. I'm like 99% sure I put it on there. And if it's not, I will make sure to put it on there and we'll re-upload it on there. But I'm like very sure that it is on that guide. And that's
one of the things
one.
You mentioned, that some teachers are getting pushback for standing up against this ideology. And I know it's really hard to stand up and to push back. But one of the things that I say to people is, if this ideology isn't something that you'll stand up against, what will you stand up against? This is an ideology that our children are being sterilized. Their bodies are being mutilated. They're being damaged. Their emotional growth is being retarded. I mean, this is horrible experimentation on children. And if this isn't enough to fight back against, what is? And I think most people, when you couch it in those terms, realize this really is. This is reality. If you can teach a child that there's no such thing as male and female, and that somebody can change their sex based on their feelings, you can teach them anything that you want. Yep. And you can completely undermine every value that people are trying to instill in children.
Absolutely. It just shows them that something that's really obvious, that's directly in front of them and has been ingrained in them since childhood and been ingrained in humanity for all of time, is no longer true. And so it's this ability to overwrite something that's as obvious and right in front of you. So it is very concerning for our child's psychological health to be able to sort out reality from fantasy. And that's going to contribute to the mental health illness that we're seeing as well. And so, we do know that the children caught up in this trans ideology are much more likely to be diagnosed with every psychological disorder and, huge rates of depression and anxiety. And like we mentioned, past history of sexual assault or other traumas. So we need to get them the help that they need. And we need to help them sort out reality from fantasy or delusion. And it's just so important for their future and psychological well-being. Okay, so another question that we had was about interacting politically. So do you have any recommendations of websites, Erin, or organizations that people can go to for more support in interacting politically and involving themselves that way on this issue?
That's a really good question. I think I would recommend Advocates Protecting Children. We have a lot of resources, but also Our Duty. Our Duty is doing something really neat. They're bringing together people from all political spectrums, from all different, backgrounds, and they're putting together a rally for the American Pediatric Association in Anaheim in October. And those are the kind of efforts that can really make a difference, bringing together people. They're going to be radical feminists there. There's going to be Christian conservatives and everybody in between. And if we all stand up and push back, we'll be successful. And so the other thing is go to Facebook, and it's a group called Compassion Coalition. And that's a very nice, very diverse group of people, but it's a place that you can go to get information about, policy that's happening, about things that you can do to fight back, about initiatives. And it is a private group, so you'll have to request to be admitted. But we tend to admit people if we feel like they're actually, interested in the issue.
Great. Yeah. And then we just recommended the Family Policy Alliance and Heritage Foundation. I know that they both do a great job of helping to alert folks when there is an action alert or something that people can do. Like right now with Title IX, if you're not aware, we need to speak out before changes are made to include gender identity, which would essentially for the entire nation eliminate women only sports and would eliminate women only spaces. So
yeah, I'd also encourage you to sign up for Family Watch International newsletter, because they tend to have a lot of action items. And I think it's the people who produced the resource book you were talking about for teachers. And I always get the name a little bit wrong, but I think
Parent Rights, I think. Yeah.
And they have a
Parental
lot
Rights
of good
Campaign.
information as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. And I think that is it for now. So thank you so much, Erin. And we really appreciate you being on with us tonight, and know that those that are with us live and those watching the recording will get a lot out of it. So thank you again for your time.
Well, and thank you so much for, helping people to understand what they can do to push back against this ideology and protect their families and children.
Of course.
Great. So again, you guys are all on our website. We hope that you find the resources helpful on that website. You can also join our Facebook group, Alliance to Protect New York's Children. And so we appreciate you guys being here with us tonight. And we're just going to close quick in prayer. Lord, we just thank you so much for having Dr. Brewer with us, Father, and we just thank you so much for her testimony and the work that she's doing. We thank you, Lord, for just all the resources that you've given us to be able to help educate and protect our children. I ask that you please help us as we go out our ways and we get ready for the back to school. I pray that you help prepare our steps, Lord, and help us to be mindful and aware of what's going on with our children and in their classrooms, Father. Please help us to be able to discuss these things with our children and to raise them up to be able to hold on to their values, Lord, and to be able to connect with reality. We thank you for all that you've done. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.